I never expected our 5th wedding anniversary dinner at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel would end with my mother-in-law screaming across the elegant dining room that I was nothing but a manipulative gold digger who had trapped her precious son. What she couldn't have anticipated was the moment of stunned silence that followed, when I calmly placed the bank statements on the white linen tablecloth, revealing that for the past 3 years, I had been the one quietly funding their comfortable retirement lifestyle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But that revelation, devastating as it was to Patricia Chen's carefully constructed narrative about our family dynamics, became the catalyst that would expose years of financial manipulation and transform me from the accommodating daughter-in-law they thought they could control into the woman who would finally claim her rightful place in her own marriage. The trouble started 3 months before our anniversary, though I didn't recognize the warning signs at the time. Brandon had been working late more frequently, taking hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, and showing an unusual interest in our household finances that he'd never demonstrated during our entire marriage. When I asked about his sudden concern with budgeting, he brushed off my questions with vague mentions of wanting to be more responsible about our future. I should have trusted my instincts, but 5 years of marriage to Brandon Chen had taught me to second-guess my perceptions when they conflicted with his family's version of reality. The Chen family had a way of making their opinions sound like indisputable facts, their preferences like moral imperatives, and their control like loving guidance. It was a sophisticated form of manipulation that worked precisely because it never announced itself as such. Patricia Chen, my mother-in-law, had perfected this art over the course of her 63 years. She spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed, offering suggestions that weren't really suggestions, and asking questions that weren't really questions. When she wondered aloud whether my freelance graphic design work was really stable enough to plan a future around, she wasn't seeking information. She was planting seeds of doubt about my professional capabilities. When she expressed concern about whether I truly understood the financial pressures Brandon faced as the family's primary breadwinner, she wasn't offering support. She was reinforcing a hierarchy where my contributions were minimized and his were elevated. The irony was so profound it would have been amusing if it weren't so destructive. While Patricia worried publicly about my financial stability and questioned my contribution to our household, I was secretly managing a portfolio worth over $8 million. The software company I had built and sold 2 years before meeting. Brandon continued to generate substantial royalties, and my subsequent investments in emerging technology startups had multiplied that initial success into genuine wealth. But I had learned early in our relationship that the Chen family viewed financial independence in women as threatening rather than impressive, so I had maintained the comfortable fiction that my graphic design freelancing represented my sole source of income. This deception hadn't begun as a calculated strategy. Initially, I had simply omitted details about my financial situation because Brandon seemed intimidated by successful women, and I was genuinely attracted to his kindness and stability. He worked as a mid-level project manager for a consulting firm, lived modestly, and approached life with a methodical carefulness that I found refreshing after years of high-stakes business decisions. When he introduced me to his family, I instinctively downplayed my professional achievements to avoid the awkward dynamics that wealth disparities can create in new relationships. What I hadn't anticipated was how this temporary omission would evolve into an elaborate ongoing performance. The Chen family's expectations became increasingly specific as our relationship progressed. Patricia expected me to defer to Brandon's career decisions, to prioritize his professional advancement over my own projects, and to demonstrate appropriate gratitude for his willingness to support a woman with such uncertain income prospects. Robert, Brandon's father, made frequent jokes about how lucky I was to have found such a stable, responsible husband willing to take care of me financially. These comments weren't malicious in intent, but they revealed fundamental assumptions about our relationship dynamics that became more problematic as time passed. The wedding planning process had been particularly revealing. Patricia insisted on managing most of the arrangements, justifying her control by explaining that since Brandon's family was paying for the majority of the celebration, they should have primary input on the details. I had quietly transferred $50,000 into Brandon's account to cover what his family couldn't afford, allowing him to contribute more substantially than his actual income would have permitted. He never asked where the money came from, and I never volunteered. This pattern of invisible financial support became the foundation of our married life, with me quietly covering expenses that exceeded his earning capacity while maintaining the public fiction that he was our household's financial anchor. The E-tie arrangement worked reasonably well for the first few years of our marriage. I genuinely enjoyed the simplicity of letting Brandon handle routine financial decisions, while I focused on my investment strategies and selective consulting projects. The Chen family's patronizing attitudes were irritating, but not intolerable. Patricia's regular commentary about my dependence on Brandon's income stung, but I told myself it was a small price to pay for domestic harmony. Robert's constant praise for his son's financial responsibility in supporting a freelancer wife was grating, but I convinced myself that his approval made Brandon happy, which was worth the personal discomfort. The system began to break down when Brandon started taking his family's narrative seriously. Somewhere during our 4th year of marriage, he internalized their portrayal of our relationship as his generous support of my unstable career, rather than recognizing it as the partnership it actually was. He began making unilateral decisions about our shared expenses, explaining that as the primary earner, he needed to take more control of our financial planning. He started questioning my freelance income with the suspicious tone of someone who believed I was hiding financial problems, rather than financial success. Most problematically, he began presenting my professional choices to his family as evidence of my impracticality, rather than defending my expertise and achievements. The shift was gradual enough that I initially attributed it to normal marital adjustment, rather than recognizing it as a fundamental change in how he viewed our partnership. When he suggested that I consider finding more stable employment with a traditional salary structure, I thought he was expressing concern about my long-term career satisfaction. When he began reviewing our household expenses with increasing scrutiny, I assumed he was developing more sophisticated financial management skills. When he started making jokes about supporting his artist wife, mimicking his father's patronizing humor, I told myself he was just trying to fit in with family expectations, rather than genuinely adopting their dismissive attitudes. The truth was more disturbing than I wanted to acknowledge. Brandon wasn't just performing for his family's benefit. He was genuinely beginning to believe that his income represented our household's financial foundation and that my contributions were supplementary, at best. This wasn't entirely his fault. The Chen family's constant reinforcement of this narrative, combined with my own reluctance to correct their misconceptions, had created a reality distortion that affected his perception of our actual circumstances. He had no idea that the comfortable lifestyle we maintained far exceeded what his salary could support, because I had been quietly subsidizing our expenses for years. The situation became more complicated when Patricia and Robert began experiencing what they delicately called temporary financial adjustments in their retirement planning. Robert's pension benefits had been reduced following his former company's bankruptcy, and their investment portfolio had suffered significant losses during a market downturn. They never directly asked for assistance, but their conversations became filled with worried references to rising healthcare costs, property tax increases, and the general challenge of maintaining their standard of living on a fixed income. Brandon's response was immediate and characteristic. He wanted to help his parents maintain their dignity while providing meaningful support, but his salary couldn't accommodate the level of assistance they needed without dramatically impacting our own lifestyle. The solution seemed obvious to me, though I couldn't suggest it directly without revealing the extent of my financial resources. Instead, I began making anonymous contributions to their household expenses, paying their property taxes through a shell company, covering their supplemental health insurance premiums through charitable donations, and ensuring their investment accounts received mysterious windfalls that appeared to result from forgotten dividend reinvestment programs. This invisible support system allowed Brandon to maintain his role as the devoted son, helping his parents through difficult times while preventing the Chen family from experiencing genuine financial hardship. Patricia and Robert never questioned these fortunate coincidences, attributing their improved circumstances to careful money management and delayed investment returns. Brandon felt proud of his ability to contribute to his parents' welfare without compromising our household security, never realizing that his contributions were possible only because I was covering the shortfall in our own expenses. The deception became increasingly elaborate as Patricia and Robert's financial needs grew. Their comfortable retirement community required substantial monthly fees that Robert's reduced pension couldn't cover. Their aging house needed significant repairs and updates that exceeded their available savings. Patricia's developing health issues required specialists and treatments that strained their insurance coverage. Each new expense became another opportunity for me to provide invisible assistance while maintaining the fiction that their son's generosity and their own careful planning had preserved their financial stability. I told myself this arrangement was sustainable and even admirable. I was using my financial resources to support Brandon's family without creating the awkward dynamics that direct wealth disclosure might have generated. Patricia and Robert maintained their dignity while receiving the assistance they needed. Brandon felt fulfilled by his ability to support his parents during challenging times. Everyone's needs were being met without anyone having to confront uncomfortable truths about money, dependency, or family dynamics. The system worked until Patricia decided it was time to address what she perceived as the fundamental problem in her son's marriage: his wife's financial dependence and lack of contribution to the family's long-term security. She had been observing our lifestyle with increasing suspicion, noting that we maintained a standard of living that seemed inconsistent with Brandon's salary and my supposedly modest freelance income. Rather than questioning whether she might be missing important information, she concluded that I must be hiding financial problems or accumulating debt that would eventually threaten Brandon's financial stability. Her solution was characteristically direct and publicly humiliating. She would use our anniversary dinner, a celebration she had insisted on organizing and hosting, as an opportunity to address my financial irresponsibility and establish clear expectations for my future behavior as a member of the Chen family. She had prepared what she clearly considered to be a reasonable and necessary intervention, designed to protect her son from what she saw as my economic recklessness and to motivate me toward more responsible financial behavior. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel's dining room provided an elegant setting for what Patricia undoubtedly envisioned as a pivotal moment in our family's development. She had reserved a private section of the restaurant, invited Brandon's sister Melissa and her husband Kevin to witness the proceedings, and prepared her remarks with the careful attention to detail that characterized all her important communications. The white linen tablecloths, crystal stemware, and soft classical music created an atmosphere of refined sophistication that she believed would lend authority to her planned confrontation. Brandon seemed unusually nervous throughout the cocktail hour, checking his phone repeatedly and glancing at his mother with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Melissa and Kevin made polite conversation about their recent vacation and upcoming home renovation projects, but their usual easy humor felt strained. Patricia herself was almost vibrating with barely contained energy, the kind of focused intensity she displayed when preparing to deliver what she considered to be necessary, but difficult truths. The explosion came during the main course, just as I was complimenting the chef's preparation of the salmon and thinking how pleasant it was to have a quiet family celebration. Patricia set down her fork with the deliberate precision of someone calling a meeting to order and fixed me with the steady gaze she used when addressing serious family business. "Natalie," she began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Brandon and I have been discussing some concerns about your financial situation and its impact on this family's long-term stability." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the table like a heavy blanket. We understand that freelance work can be unpredictable, and we appreciate that you're trying to contribute to the household in your own way." The condescension in her tone was so familiar, I almost didn't react to it. Almost. But something about the formal setting, the public nature of the confrontation, and the obvious coordination with Brandon made this feel different from her usual passive-aggressive commentary about my professional choices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "However," she continued, "we can no longer ignore the reality that your income situation is placing an unfair burden on Brandon and preventing this family from achieving the financial security we all deserve." She gestured slightly toward her son, who was staring at his plate with uncomfortable intensity. "Brandon works extremely hard to provide for you both, and it's not fair for him to carry the entire financial responsibility while you pursue uncertain creative projects." The word creative was delivered with the subtle disdain Patricia reserved for activities she considered frivolous or self-indulgent. In her worldview, practical employment that produced steady paychecks represented maturity and responsibility, while any work that involved artistic elements or variable income streams indicated a fundamental lack of seriousness about adult obligations. Robert cleared his throat and joined the conversation with the jovial tone he used when delivering criticism disguised as friendly advice. "Now, Patty, let's be fair. Natalie works hard at her design projects, but Patricia, you raise a valid point about stability. In my day, couples planned their finances together, and both partners contributed predictably to the household security." He smiled at me with what he probably intended as encouragement. "Maybe it's time to consider something more traditional, Natalie. A steady job with benefits and regular hours might give you both more peace of mind." Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly aware that this conversation had been planned without her input, but uncertain about how to respond. Kevin studied his wine glass with the focused attention of someone desperately wishing to be anywhere else. Brandon continued, staring at his dinner, his jaw clenched in a way that suggested he was struggling with his own discomfort about the situation. The moment stretched uncomfortably as I processed what was happening. This wasn't a spontaneous expression of concern. This was a coordinated intervention designed to pressure me into abandoning my professional autonomy and accepting employment. That would satisfy Patricia's definition of appropriate contribution to the family's financial welfare. The public setting ensured I couldn't respond with the kind of direct confrontation that might have been possible in a private conversation. The presence of witnesses created social pressure to respond graciously to what was being presented as loving concern rather than what it actually was, a systematic attempt to control my professional choices and economic independence. I felt a familiar urge to accommodate, to find a diplomatic response that would defuse the tension without creating permanent damage to family relationships. For 5 years, I had prioritized harmony over authenticity, allowing the Chen family's misconceptions to persist rather than risking the social disruption that truth-telling might create. The pattern was so established that my initial instinct was to thank them for their concern, promise to consider more traditional employment options, and privately resent their interference while publicly appearing grateful for their guidance. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the public nature of their attack, or the realization that Brandon had participated in planning this ambush, or the accumulated frustration of years of financial invisibility. Whatever the catalyst, I found myself unable to summon the diplomatic response that would have preserved surface peace while ensuring continued manipulation. Instead, I did something I had never done before in a Chen family gathering. I told them the truth. "Actually, Patricia," I said quietly, setting down my own fork and meeting her gaze directly, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about our family's financial situation that we should probably address." I reached into my purse and withdrew, a manila folder I had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment to have this conversation with Brandon privately. The folder contained recent statements from my primary investment accounts, documentation of the software company sale, and records of the anonymous contributions I had been making to Patricia and Robert's expenses for the past 3 years. The documents made a soft rustling sound as I placed them on the white tablecloth between the elegant place settings and flickering candles. The contrast was striking. Official financial records with their stark numbers and formal letterheads sitting among the refined dinner service like uninvited guests at an exclusive party. "Brandon," I said, still speaking quietly but with a firmness that surprised even me, "I think your family deserves to understand who's actually been paying for their comfortable retirement." The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in a Chen family gathering. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions, from confident expectation to confusion, to something approaching panic as she began to process what the documents might contain. Robert's jovial demeanor disappeared entirely, replaced by the sharp attention of someone suddenly aware that familiar ground had shifted beneath his feet. Melissa and Kevin exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand they had inadvertently become witnesses to something far more significant than a routine family discussion about financial responsibility. Brandon finally looked up from his plate, his expression a complex mixture of confusion, dread, and dawning realization. "Natalie," he said carefully, "what are those papers?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that everything that happened next would determine not just the immediate outcome of this dinner, but the fundamental structure of our marriage and my relationship with his family. For 5 years, I had chosen accommodation over authenticity, harmony over honesty, diplomatic silence over uncomfortable truth. The documents on the table represented a complete reversal of that strategy, a moment of transparency that would make continued deception impossible. I picked up the first statement, a summary of my primary investment portfolio showing a current value of just over $4 million, and placed it directly in front of Patricia. The numbers were clearly visible in the restaurant's soft lighting, impossible to misinterpret or dismiss. "This represents about half of my current assets," I explained, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "The software company I sold generated the initial capital, and strategic investments over the past few years have grown the portfolio substantially. I've been using these resources to cover household expenses that exceed Brandon's salary and to provide anonymous support for your retirement needs." Patricia stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. The figure at the bottom of the page was larger than most people's annual salaries, representing wealth that dwarfed anything the Chen family had ever accumulated. Her carefully constructed narrative about my financial dependence and Brandon's generous support was crumbling with each number she processed. Robert reached for the document with shaking hands, his usual confidence replaced by obvious bewilderment. $4 million, he repeated slowly, as if saying the words might help him understand their reality. "You have $4 million? About half of my liquid assets," I confirmed, placing additional statements on the table. "The real estate investments, startup equity positions, and retirement accounts bring the total to approximately $8.3 million. I've been conservative in my estimates to account for market fluctuations." The mathematical impossibility of their assumptions was becoming undeniable. Brandon's annual salary, while respectable, couldn't have supported our lifestyle even with careful budgeting. The vacations we took, the quality of our home, the ease with which we handled unexpected expenses, the generous gifts we gave at family celebrations, all of it required resources far beyond what his paycheck provided. I had been subsidizing our entire standard of living while allowing them to believe he was single-handedly supporting both of us. But the revelation that devastated Patricia most completely was yet to come. I placed a thick folder of financial records in front of her, documents that told a story she had never imagined possible. "These are records of the anonymous contributions I've been making to support your retirement," I explained, opening the folder to reveal monthly payment schedules, property tax payments, health insurance premiums, and home maintenance expenses. "For the past 3 years, I've been covering approximately 60% of your living costs to ensure you could maintain your lifestyle without financial stress. The numbers were irrefutable. Payments that coincided exactly with improvements in Patricia and Robert's financial situation. Anonymous donations that had appeared just when they needed them most. Mysterious investment gains that had prevented them from having to downsize their lifestyle or compromise their comfort. Every fortunate coincidence they had attributed to careful planning or delayed investment returns had actually been carefully orchestrated financial support from the daughter-in-law they considered economically worthless. Patricia's face had gone completely pale, her usual composure shattered by the realization that everything she believed about our family's financial dynamics was not just wrong, but precisely backward. The gold digger she had been publicly accusing of exploiting her son's generosity had actually been the invisible foundation supporting the entire family's economic stability. Brandon looked as if he might be physically sick. The proud narrative he had internalized about supporting his artistic wife and helping his parents through financial difficulties was collapsing in real time. Every conversation where he had worried about my financial instability, every moment when he had felt generous about covering my expenses, every time he had bragged to his family about providing for our household, all of it had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about who was actually supporting whom. The silence stretched until Patricia found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" she asked, staring at the documents spread across the table. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question was so loaded with implications that I wasn't sure how to begin answering it. Why had I allowed them to believe I was financially dependent when I was actually financially independent? Why had I permitted years of condescending commentary about my income when I was secretly supporting their lifestyle? Why had I chosen invisible generosity over honest disclosure about my capabilities and resources? Because, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. Your family made it very clear from the beginning that successful women were threatening, that traditional gender roles were important to you, and that Brandon's role as provider was central to how you viewed our marriage. I tried to preserve those dynamics while still contributing meaningfully to our family's welfare. The explanation sounded inadequate even to me, though it accurately captured the complex motivations that had shaped my choices. I had genuinely wanted to avoid the social complications that wealth disclosure might create, but I had also been responding to subtle and not-so-subtle messages about appropriate behavior for Brandon's wife. The Chen family's comfort with traditional power structures had influenced my decision to maintain financial invisibility, even when that invisibility came at significant personal cost. Patricia was reading through the anonymous contribution records with growing horror, recognizing payment after payment that had preserved her comfort and dignity during what she had believed was a period of successful financial management. The retirement community fees, the medical expenses, the home repairs, the property taxes, nearly every significant expense from the past 3 years had been partially or completely covered by my invisible support system. "You've been," she started, then stopped, unable to complete the sentence. The revelation was too complete, too devastating to her understanding of reality. She had spent years worrying about her son's financial burden in supporting me, when the actual situation was that I had been supporting all of them. Brandon finally spoke, his voice hollow with shock and something that might have been shame. "Natalie, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? We're married. We're supposed to share these things." His question touched the heart of what had gone wrong in our relationship. We were supposed to share important information, but the Chen family's attitudes had created an environment where my financial success felt like a liability rather than an asset. I had chosen secrecy over transparency because I believed honesty would create more problems than it solved. That calculation had clearly been wrong, but the reasoning behind it wasn't entirely irrational. The dining room around us had grown quiet, other guests perhaps sensing the tension at our table even if they couldn't hear our conversation. The elegant anniversary celebration Patricia had planned as a venue for addressing my financial inadequacy had instead become the setting for revelations that would fundamentally alter every relationship around the table. As I looked at the faces, staring back at me, Patricia's shock, Robert's bewilderment, Brandon's confusion, Melissa and Kevin's obvious discomfort, I realized that everything that happened next would depend on how we processed this moment of complete transparency. The comfortable lies that had structured our family dynamics for 5 years were no longer sustainable. We would have to build new relationships based on accurate information about who we actually were, rather than who we had pretended to be. The question was whether the Chen family could adapt to a reality where their assumptions about gender, money, and family hierarchy had been completely overturned, or whether this revelation would destroy the relationships we had all worked to maintain. Either way, there was no returning to the comfortable deceptions that had brought us to this moment. The truth was finally visible, and it would reshape everything that came after. The ride home from the Fairmont Olympic Hotel occurred in complete silence, a heavy quiet that felt different from any disagreement Brandon and I had experienced during our 5 years of marriage. This wasn't the comfortable silence of two people processing a shared experience, nor was it the tense quiet that follows a typical marital argument. This was the profound stillness that settles over people when fundamental assumptions about reality have been shattered and nobody knows what words might be safe to speak. Brandon gripped the steering wheel with unusual intensity, his knuckles white against the black leather as he navigated Seattle's evening traffic. His jaw remained clenched in the same rigid position it had held throughout the remainder of dinner. After Patricia had finally managed to collect herself enough to suggest we all needed time to process what had been revealed. The suggestion had been delivered in the careful tone of someone trying to maintain dignity, while their entire worldview collapsed around them. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar cityscape, seeing the lights of downtown Seattle with strange new clarity. For 3 years, I had driven these same streets while maintaining an elaborate fiction about my place in the world, my contribution to our household, and my relationship with Brandon's family. Every building, every intersection, every familiar landmark had been part of a geography I navigated while pretending to be someone I wasn't. The revelation at dinner hadn't just exposed financial deceptions. It had revealed the extent to which I had been living as a character in someone else's story, rather than as the authentic protagonist of my own life. When we finally reached our house in the Queen Anne neighborhood, Brandon sat in the driveway for several long minutes after turning off the engine. The automatic garage door opener remained untouched on the visor above his head, as if crossing the threshold into our shared domestic space might force conversations neither of us felt prepared to have. Our home, a beautifully restored 1920s craftsman that we had purchased 2 years earlier, represented another layer of deception that would now require examination. Brandon believed we had stretched financially to afford the house, carefully, budgeting and saving to make the mortgage payments manageable on his salary. In reality, I had purchased the property outright and structured the payments to create the appearance of a manageable stretch rather than an easy acquisition. The house itself told the story of our relationship's fundamental dishonesty. Every renovation project, every piece of furniture, every improvement we had made together had been possible because of resources Brandon didn't know existed. When we had decided to update the kitchen with high-end appliances and custom cabinetry, I had quietly arranged for additional funds to cover the costs, while allowing Brandon to believe we were making a significant but manageable investment in our home's value. When unexpected repairs arose, as they inevitably did with an older house, I ensured that our household budget could absorb the expenses without creating genuine financial stress. The comfortable lifestyle we maintained, which Brandon attributed to careful money management and his steady income, was actually sustained by my invisible financial contributions. The deception extended to countless small details that would now require honest examination. The vacation to Hawaii we had taken for our 3rd anniversary, which Brandon had proudly planned and paid for as a demonstration of his financial responsibility, had been possible only because I had been covering our routine household expenses during the months he saved for the trip. The new car he had purchased after his promotion, a symbol of his professional advancement and increased earning capacity, had fit into our budget because I had been subsidizing our living costs to create space for the additional payment. Even the generous gifts we gave at family celebrations, which enhanced Brandon's reputation as a thoughtful and successful son, had been funded by resources he didn't know existed. Finally, Brandon opened the garage door and pulled the car inside. The familiar mechanical sound seemed unusually loud in the enclosed space, emphasizing the awkward silence that continued to stretch between us. As we walked through the mudroom, into our kitchen, every element of our domestic environment felt charged with new significance. The granite countertops I had quietly upgraded, the hardwood floors I had refinished without touching our household budget, the custom lighting fixtures that had appeared to be careful purchases spread over several months, but had actually been selected and installed as a coordinated design project funded by my investment returns. Brandon moved through the kitchen with the uncertain steps of someone navigating familiar territory that had suddenly become foreign. He opened the refrigerator, stared at its contents for several seconds without apparent purpose, then closed it again without removing anything. The ritual seemed to represent his broader confusion about how to behave in a domestic space that no longer matched his understanding of our financial reality. I stood near the kitchen island, unsure whether to begin the conversation we clearly needed to have or wait for Brandon to process the evening's revelations at his own pace. The choice was taken from me when he finally turned to face me directly, his expression a complex mixture of confusion, hurt, and something that might have been anger. $8 million, he said quietly, as if testing whether the number sounded more believable when spoken aloud in our own home rather than in the formal dining room where it had first been revealed. You have $8 million, and you never thought to mention it. The statement hung between us like an accusation, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was being accused of. Deception, certainly, but the moral weight of that deception remained unclear. Had I betrayed our marriage by maintaining financial privacy, or had I been protecting our relationship from complications that honest disclosure might have created? The question felt important, but I wasn't sure either of us was prepared to answer it objectively. I wanted to share that information with you, I replied carefully, choosing words that acknowledged his hurt without accepting blame for choices that had seemed reasonable at the time. But your family made it very clear that they valued traditional relationship dynamics, and I was concerned that financial disclosure might create problems we weren't prepared to handle. The explanation sounded defensive even to me, though it accurately captured the reasoning that had guided my decisions throughout our marriage. The Chen family's attitudes toward gender roles, financial responsibility, and appropriate behavior for wives had created an environment where my financial independence felt like a complication rather than an asset. I had chosen secrecy over transparency because I believed honesty would undermine the family harmony that seemed to matter so much to Brandon. His response revealed the depth of his confusion about how to process what he had learned. So you decided to just let us all believe you were struggling financially while you were secretly rich? You let my parents worry about our stability while you were paying their bills? You let me feel proud of supporting our household while you were actually covering everything? Each question struck at a different aspect of the deception, and I realized that the financial secrecy had created multiple layers of misunderstanding that would be difficult to untangle. Brandon's pride in his role as provider, his parents' satisfaction in their careful retirement planning, his family's confidence in their ability to offer helpful guidance about financial responsibility, all of it had been based on incomplete information that I had deliberately allowed to persist. The most painful realization was that my invisible support system had prevented the Chen family from developing accurate perceptions of their own capabilities and limitations. Patricia and Robert genuinely believed they had successfully managed their retirement transition, not recognizing that their comfort had been maintained through external assistance. Brandon truly thought his income was sufficient to support our lifestyle, unaware that his earning capacity fell significantly short of our actual expenses. The family's financial confidence was entirely illusory, built on subsidies they didn't know existed. I thought I was protecting everyone from uncomfortable complications, I admitted, recognizing how inadequate that justification sounded when spoken aloud. Your family seemed happier believing in traditional financial arrangements, and I was happy to provide support without disrupting those dynamics. Brandon walked to the kitchen window and stared out at our backyard, another space that reflected financial decisions made without his full understanding of our resources. The landscaping we had installed, the deck we had built, the hot tub that had appeared to be a carefully saved for luxury purchase, all of it had been easily affordable given my actual financial situation, but had been presented as significant household investments that required careful budgeting and planning. But we're married, Natalie, he said without turning around. We're supposed to make decisions together. How can we plan for the future if I don't even understand our present situation? His question touched the fundamental problem with the deception I had maintained. Marriage theoretically required transparency about significant issues, but the Chen family's attitudes had made financial honesty feel risky rather than beneficial. I had prioritized avoiding conflict over building genuine partnership, choosing surface harmony over authentic communication. The result was a relationship built on assumptions that were not just wrong, but systematically inverted from reality. The conversation was interrupted by Brandon's phone, which had been buzzing intermittently since we left the restaurant. He glanced at the screen and winced visibly before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said wearily, putting the call on speaker without asking my permission. The gesture felt significant, a small indication that our previous patterns of private family communication might be changing. Patricia's voice filled our kitchen, carrying the strained composure of someone struggling to maintain dignity after a public humiliation. "Brandon, I've been thinking about what happened tonight, and I believe we all need to have a more thorough conversation about this situation." Her careful word choice revealed the extent of her discomfort with what had been revealed. Rather than acknowledging the specific reality of my financial support for their retirement, she was characterizing the evening's events as a situation that required further discussion. The passive language allowed her to avoid directly confronting the fact that her assumptions about our family's financial dynamics had been completely wrong. "What kind of conversation, Mom?" Brandon asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected what she might propose. "I think it would be beneficial for all of us to meet with a financial advisor, someone who can help us understand how to properly integrate these new resources into our family's long-term planning." Patricia's voice carried the measured authority she used when presenting ideas she expected others to accept without significant resistance. The suggestion revealed her fundamental inability to process what had actually occurred. Rather than recognizing that her perceptions of family dynamics needed to change, she was proposing a solution that would allow her to maintain control over financial decisions, while incorporating my resources into plans she would help develop. The idea of independent wealth belonging to me personally, rather than representing family assets to be managed collectively, seemed beyond her conceptual framework. "Mom, I don't think you understand," Brandon began, then stopped, apparently unsure how to explain something he was still struggling to comprehend himself. "What I understand," Patricia continued, "is that this family has been operating under some significant misunderstandings about financial responsibility and contribution. Those misunderstandings need to be addressed through proper planning and communication, not through more secrets and separate decision-making." Her response demonstrated the sophisticated defense mechanisms that had allowed her to maintain authority despite being fundamentally wrong about important family issues. Rather than acknowledging error, she was reframing the situation as a communication problem that required better coordination rather than a power structure that needed fundamental revision. My financial independence wasn't being recognized as an individual asset, but as a family resource that had been improperly managed through inadequate consultation with appropriate authorities. "Patricia," I interjected, deciding that continued silence would only allow further mischaracterization of the situation. I appreciate your interest in family financial planning, but these are my personal assets, developed through my own professional activities before and during my marriage too. Brandon, they don't require integration into family planning because they're not family assets. The silence that followed my statement was profound enough that I wondered whether the call had been disconnected. When Patricia finally responded, her voice carried a sharp edge that revealed the limits of her diplomatic composure. Natalie, dear, I think you're confused about how marriage works. When you joined this family, your individual resources became part of our collective welfare. That's what commitment means. That's what partnership requires. This secretive, independent approach to financial management is exactly the kind of thinking that creates problems in marriages. Her response revealed the fundamental worldview that had shaped every interaction since I joined the Chen family. In Patricia's understanding, marriage required the subordination of individual identity to collective family welfare, with financial resources automatically becoming available for family decisions regardless of their source or the preferences of their owner. My independence wasn't being viewed as an asset to be respected, but as selfishness to be corrected through proper guidance and expectations. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia alternating between expressions of concern about family unity and barely concealed demands for access to financial information she believed she was entitled to review. Robert occasionally contributed supportive comments that reinforced Patricia's perspective while maintaining his characteristic tone of friendly reasonableness. Neither seemed capable of recognizing that the evening's revelations had exposed the inadequacy of their assumptions rather than confirming the need for better family financial coordination. After Brandon finally ended the call, we sat in our kitchen facing each other across the granite island that represented another invisible subsidy in our shared domestic life. The conversation with his parents had clarified something important. The financial deception was just one symptom of a broader problem with authenticity and power dynamics that extended throughout our marriage and his family relationships. I need to understand something, Brandon said finally, his voice carrying a seriousness I rarely heard from him. When you decided not to tell me about the money, was it because you didn't trust me, or because you didn't trust my family? The question was more perceptive than I had expected, cutting directly to the heart of motivations I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. The answer required honesty about judgments I had made regarding his character, his independence, and his ability to maintain appropriate boundaries with his parents. Both, I admitted after a long pause. I was concerned that financial disclosure would change how you saw our relationship, but I was also worried about how your family would respond to information that contradicted their expectations about appropriate gender roles and family dynamics. Brandon nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed suspicions he had been developing. They do have very specific ideas about how things should work, he said quietly. I've been telling myself that their opinions didn't matter as long as we were happy, but I guess I've been letting their expectations influence my behavior more than I realized. His acknowledgement represented the first sign that he might be capable of examining his own role in the dynamics that had created our current situation. For 5 years, I had been the only person in our relationship who recognized the gap between public presentation and private reality. If Brandon could develop his own awareness of these patterns, we might be able to build a more authentic partnership going forward. The conversation was interrupted again, this time by my own phone. The caller ID showed Diana Rodriguez, my attorney, and one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial situation. I had been working with Diana for 3 years, initially for investment structuring and tax planning, but increasingly for advice about protecting assets within the context of a marriage where financial disclosure had become complicated. Natalie? Diana's voice carried the professional urgency I had learned to associate with significant legal developments. I've been monitoring some unusual activity related to your accounts, and I think we need to talk immediately. What kind of Activity? I asked, though something in her tone suggested I wouldn't like the answer. Someone has been making inquiries about your investment portfolio and business assets. The inquiries are coming through legal channels, which suggests they're being made by someone with legitimate authority, or at least the appearance of legitimate authority. Given what you've told me about your family situation, I'm concerned these inquiries might be related to your recent disclosures. The implications hit me immediately. The Chen family's phone call about family financial planning hadn't been merely an expression of interest in coordination. It had been the beginning of a more systematic effort to gain access to information and potentially control over assets they now knew existed. Diana continued with the detailed efficiency that made her an excellent attorney. The inquiries are coming from Harrington, Webb & Associates, which is a well-established family law firm here in Seattle. They're not making direct claims yet, but they're clearly researching asset division protocols and community property regulations as they apply to undisclosed wealth in marriage situations. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with Seattle's evening temperature. The Chen family wasn't just interested in family financial planning. They were exploring legal mechanisms for claiming access to assets I had developed independently, using the marriage relationship as justification for overriding my individual property rights. Brandon had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. When I ended the call, his expression reflected the same dawning awareness I was experiencing. This wasn't just about financial disclosure or family coordination. This had become a conflict over fundamental questions of individual autonomy, marital property rights, and the extent to which family relationships could be used to justify overriding personal boundaries. They hired a lawyer, he said quietly, as if speaking the words might help him process their implications. My parents hired a family law attorney to research your assets. The betrayal went deeper than I had initially realized. The Chen family hadn't just been surprised by my financial disclosure. They had immediately begun taking steps to position themselves legally to benefit from resources they had discovered, using their relationship with Brandon as potential justification for claims against assets I had developed through my own professional activities. Brandon's phone buzzed with a text message that he read with visible dismay. "It's from my dad," he said, showing me the screen. "He wants to know if I can get copies of your financial statements for their meeting with their attorney tomorrow morning." The request was so brazen it took my breath away. Less than 4 hours after learning about assets they had no legal claim to, the Chen family was already attempting to use Brandon as a conduit for obtaining detailed financial information they intended to present to legal counsel. They weren't interested in family coordination or improved communication. They were pursuing what amounted to a financial takeover using marriage and family relationships as weapons. I looked at Brandon, waiting to see how he would respond to his family's attempt to use him as an instrument for violating my financial privacy. His answer would determine whether our marriage had any chance of surviving the revelations that had begun at dinner, or whether the Chen family's influence over his decision-making had made genuine partnership impossible. He deleted the text message without responding, then turned to face me directly. "I think," he said slowly, "that I'm beginning to understand what you meant about invisible boundaries and family expectations. I've been so focused on making everyone happy that I haven't been paying attention to who was paying the real costs." His acknowledgement felt like the first authentic moment we had shared since our wedding day. For 5 years, our relationship had been shaped by performances designed to satisfy external expectations, rather than by honest communication about our actual circumstances and preferences. The financial deception had been a symptom of broader problems with authenticity that affected every aspect of our shared life. But recognizing the problem and solving it were different challenges entirely. The Chen family's immediate mobilization of legal resources demonstrated that they viewed my assets as a family opportunity rather than respecting them as individual property. Their willingness to use Brandon as a source of financial information revealed the extent to which they considered family relationships to be tools for achieving their objectives, rather than bonds requiring mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. The phone rang again, this time showing Patricia's number. Brandon looked at the display, then at me, before making a decision that felt symbolic of much larger choices about loyalty and independence. He turned off the phone without answering. "We have a lot to figure out," he said quietly. "But I think we need to figure it out together, without my parents' input. At least until we understand what we actually want from our own relationship." The statement represented the first clear indication that Brandon might be capable of choosing partnership with me over accommodation to his family's expectations. But the legal inquiry Diana had reported meant that our personal relationship dynamics were no longer the only concern. The Chen family had escalated the situation beyond emotional manipulation into potential legal action, transforming what might have been a private marital issue into a conflict that would require strategic, defensive assets and rights I had never expected to have to protect within the context of my own marriage. As we sat in our kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable domestic environment that had been maintained through financial arrangements, Brandon was only beginning to understand. I realized that the evening's revelations had set in motion forces that would require much more than improved communication to resolve. The Chen family's response to my financial disclosure had revealed their fundamental character in ways that changed everything about our relationship dynamics going forward. The woman who had quietly accommodated their expectations for 5 years was about to discover what happened when accommodation was no longer sufficient to preserve the peace. The next phase of this conflict would require strategic thinking, legal preparation, and personal strength I hadn't needed to develop during the years when invisible support and diplomatic silence had seemed like adequate approaches to family harmony. The awakening that had begun with financial disclosure was expanding into something much more comprehensive, a complete reconsideration of power, authenticity, and the price of maintaining relationships built on fundamental misunderstandings about who held the real authority and resources. The comfortable deceptions that had structured our family dynamics were collapsing, and what emerged from their ruins would determine whether genuine partnership was possible or whether the Chen family's vision of collective control would ultimately prevail. Diana Rodriguez arrived at my downtown Seattle office at 7:30 the following morning, carrying 2 large coffee cups and wearing the focused expression that meant she had been working since before dawn. Her law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, but she had requested this meeting at my business headquarters in Pioneer Square, a restored 19th-century building that housed the investment management company I had established after selling my software venture. The office space reflected my actual professional identity rather than the freelance graphic designer persona I had maintained for the Chen family's benefit. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Elliott Bay, while the interior featured clean modern furniture and state-of-the-art technology systems that supported my role as an active investor in emerging technology companies. The contrast with the modest home office where I supposedly conducted my design freelancing was stark enough to represent 2 completely different professional lives. Diana set one of the coffee cups on my desk and opened her briefcase with the efficient movements of someone who had spent most of the night preparing for a complex legal battle. The documents she withdrew painted a disturbing picture of how quickly the Chen family had mobilized resources to position themselves for a potential claim against assets they had discovered fewer than 12 hours earlier. Harrington, Webb, and Associates filed preliminary research requests at 6 o'clock this morning, she began, spreading legal documents across my desk. They're exploring community property claims under Washington state law, investigating whether your premarital assets might be subject to division despite the timing of their acquisition, and researching precedents for spousal support claims when significant wealth disparities exist. The speed and sophistication of their legal strategy was breathtaking. The Chen family hadn't spent the night processing the emotional implications of my financial disclosure. They had immediately consulted with experienced family law attorneys and begun building a case for accessing resources they believed they were entitled to claim through Brandon's marriage to me. More concerning, Diana continued, placing additional documents on the desk. They've also filed inquiries about potential fraud claims related to what they're characterizing as deliberate misrepresentation of financial circumstances during the marriage. They're suggesting that your failure to disclose assets might constitute a form of fraud that would invalidate normal community property protections. The legal theory was creative and deeply disturbing. Rather than acknowledging that my financial privacy had been a personal choice, the Chen family's attorneys were framing it as deliberate deception that had damaged their client's ability to make informed decisions about marital finances. The approach could potentially transform my choice to maintain financial independence into grounds for legal action that would override my individual property rights. I walked to the window overlooking the bay, trying to process the implications of what Diana was describing. The Chen family's response to my disclosure had revealed their fundamental character in ways that changed everything about our relationship dynamics. They hadn't been shocked by the revelation of my wealth. They had been energized by the opportunity it represented. Diana's voice pulled me back to the immediate legal challenges. There's something else you need to understand, Natalie. The initial inquiries suggest they're not just researching Brandon's potential claims, they're also exploring whether Patricia and Robert might have standing to make claims based on their financial dependence on support they didn't know was coming from you. The concept was so outrageous, I initially thought I had misunderstood her meaning. Are you saying they think they can claim ownership of my assets because I helped with their retirement expenses? That's exactly what I'm saying, Diana confirmed grimly. Their legal theory is that by providing anonymous support for their living expenses, you created a form of financial relationship that gives them equitable claims to ongoing support. They're arguing that your undisclosed wealth created dependencies that you're now legally obligated to maintain. The audacity of their legal strategy was staggering. The Chen family was attempting to transform my generous support for their retirement into a legal obligation that would give them permanent claims against my assets. Rather than expressing gratitude for assistance that had maintained their comfortable lifestyle, they were exploring ways to use that assistance as grounds for ongoing financial entitlement. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Brandon, whose name appeared on the screen along with a message indicating he was calling from his parents' house. I accepted the call and put it on speaker so Diana could hear the conversation. Natalie. Brandon's voice carried a strain I had never heard before. I'm at my parents' house, and there are some things happening that I think you need to know about. What kind of things? I asked, though Diana's legal briefing had already prepared me for disturbing developments. They have lawyers here, Brandon said quietly, as if he were trying to avoid being overheard. 2 attorneys from some family law firm, and they've been asking me questions about our finances, our lifestyle, and about what I knew about your money situation. Diana and I exchanged glances. The Chen family hadn't just been researching legal options. They had already begun building their case by interviewing Brandon as a potential witness in whatever legal action they were planning to pursue. What kind of questions? I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the anger building inside me. They wanted to know about our household expenses, about the vacations we've taken, about the house, about gifts we've given to family members. They asked whether I ever suspected you had more money than you were telling me about, and whether I would have made different decisions if I had known about your assets. Each question revealed another aspect of the legal strategy the Chen family was developing. They weren't just exploring claims against my current assets. They were building a case that my financial privacy had damaged Brandon's ability to make informed decisions about his own life, creating potential grounds for claims that extended beyond normal community property divisions. Brandon's voice dropped even lower. Natalie, they also asked me to sign some papers. Something about authorizing them to represent my interests in discussions about marital asset division and family financial planning. They said it was just a precaution to make sure I was protected, but I told them I needed to think about it. Diana immediately leaned forward, her expression urgent. Brandon, this is Diana Rodriguez, Natalie's attorney. Do not sign anything without having independent legal counsel review it first. The documents they're asking you to sign could give them authority to act on your behalf in legal proceedings against your wife. The warning seemed to shake Brandon's composure even further. Legal proceedings? He repeated. They said this was just about family financial planning and making sure everyone's interests were protected. Diana's response was swift and direct. Brandon, your parents have retained family law attorneys who are researching claims against Natalie's assets. This isn't about financial planning. This is about potential litigation to force access to resources they believe they're entitled to claim through your marriage. The silence that followed Diana's explanation stretched long enough that I wondered whether Brandon had ended the call. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of shock and what sounded like genuine horror. They told me this was about protecting our family's future, he said slowly. They said Natalie had been keeping secrets that could hurt our financial security, and they wanted to make sure we had professional guidance to handle the situation properly. The Chen family's misrepresentation of their legal mobilization revealed the same pattern of manipulation that had characterized their behavior throughout our marriage. Rather than acknowledging their attempt to make claims against my assets, they had presented their legal strategy to Brandon as protective measures designed to ensure his welfare. The deception was sophisticated enough to exploit his trust while concealing their actual intentions. Diana's legal training allowed her to cut through the emotional complexity to focus on immediate tactical concerns. Brandon, you need to understand that anything you tell those attorneys could be used against Natalie in legal proceedings. Your parents' lawyers are not representing your interests. They're building a case to benefit Patricia and Robert's claims against your wife's assets. The phone went quiet again before Brandon's voice returned, now carrying a firmness I hadn't heard from him in years. I'm leaving here now, he said. I'm not signing anything, and I'm not answering any more questions. This isn't what I thought it was. After the call ended, Diana and I spent the next hour reviewing the legal documents she had obtained through her professional network. The Chen family's strategy was more comprehensive than I had initially understood, incorporating multiple legal theories that could potentially expose my assets to claims from various family members under different circumstances. The community property research focused on Washington state's laws regarding marital assets, exploring whether my premarital wealth could be subject to division if it had been used to support our shared lifestyle during the marriage. The fraud investigation examined whether my failure to disclose assets constituted a form of deception that would invalidate normal property protections. Most disturbingly, the dependency claims research suggested that Patricia and Robert might be able to argue for ongoing financial support based on their reliance on assistance they hadn't known was coming from me. Each legal theory represented a different avenue for accessing resources I had developed through my own professional activities, using family relationships as justification for overriding individual property rights. The sophistication of their approach suggested they had been planning this strategy since the moment they learned about my financial situation, possibly even before. Diana's assessment was blunt and concerning. They've retained one of Seattle's most aggressive family law firms, and they're pursuing multiple legal theories simultaneously. This isn't a fishing expedition. This is a coordinated campaign to establish claims against your assets using every available legal mechanism. The realization that I was facing a comprehensive legal assault, rather than a family disagreement about financial disclosure, changed everything about how I needed to respond. The Chen family's actions had moved beyond emotional manipulation into territory that required strategic defense of assets and rights I had never expected to have to protect within the context of my own marriage. My phone rang again, this time showing Patricia's number. I looked at Diana, who nodded encouragingly. Sometimes understanding your opponent's strategy required listening to what they were willing to say directly. Patricia's voice filled my office, with the same controlled authority she had always used when addressing family business. But now I could hear the underlying calculation that had always been present, but which I had previously attributed to caring concern. Natalie, dear, I hope you've had time to think about our conversation last night. Robert and I have been discussing the situation with some professional advisors, and we believe we've identified some approaches that could benefit everyone involved. The phrase professional advisors confirmed that Patricia was referring to the family law attorneys who had been researching claims against my assets since dawn. Her characterization of their legal strategy as approaches that could benefit everyone revealed the same pattern of misrepresentation she had used throughout our relationship. "What kind of approaches?" I asked, curious to hear how she would present what Diana had described as a coordinated legal assault. "Well," Patricia began, her tone carrying the patient reasonableness she used when explaining complex matters to people she considered less sophisticated. "We've learned that there are some important legal considerations when significant assets haven't been properly disclosed within a marriage. These considerations could create problems for you if they're not addressed through appropriate planning and documentation." The threat was delivered with characteristic indirection, but its meaning was unmistakable. Patricia was informing me that they had discovered legal vulnerabilities in my financial privacy and were prepared to exploit those vulnerabilities if I didn't cooperate with their demands for access to my assets. Diana was taking notes as Patricia continued her explanation. "The professional advisors have suggested that the best approach would be to establish a family trust structure that would protect everyone's interests while ensuring that resources are managed appropriately for the benefit of the entire family." The proposal revealed the true scope of their ambitions. The Chen family wasn't just seeking access to my assets. They wanted control over how those assets were managed, distributed, and used. The trust structure Patricia was describing would effectively transfer my individual wealth into a family entity that could be governed by collective decision-making, giving them veto power over my financial choices. "That's an interesting suggestion," I replied carefully, glancing at Diana, who was shaking her head emphatically. "But I'm not sure why my personal assets would need to be managed through a family trust structure." Patricia's response revealed the extent of her legal briefing. "Natalie, dear, I think you may not fully understand the implications of keeping significant assets separate within a marriage. There are potential tax consequences, legal liabilities, and family security issues that could create problems for everyone if they're not properly addressed." Each concern she mentioned corresponded to legal theories that Diana had identified in the research documents. The Chen family's attorneys had clearly provided Patricia with talking points designed to create pressure for voluntary cooperation while concealing the coercive nature of their actual legal strategy. Diana gestured for me to continue the conversation, while she prepared written responses to the various legal theories Patricia was advancing. The attorney's strategy was becoming clear. They were hoping to convince me to voluntarily surrender control over my assets by presenting legal compliance as a matter of family responsibility, rather than revealing their intention to pursue claims through litigation if necessary. "Patricia," I said slowly, "I appreciate your concern about proper financial management, but I'm comfortable with my current asset structure. I have experienced legal and financial advisors who help me manage these matters appropriately." The mention of my own professional advisors clearly surprised Patricia, who had apparently assumed that I lacked sophisticated representation. Her voice sharpened noticeably as she responded. "I'm sure you have advisors, dear, but they may not be familiar with the specific legal requirements that apply to marital assets in Washington state. The professionals we've consulted have extensive experience with these particular issues, and they've identified some potential problems that really should be addressed promptly." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on my office door. Marcus Thompson, my business partner and the person who managed day-to-day operations of our investment firm, entered with an expression of concern that suggested he had urgent information to share. "I need to speak with you immediately," he said, glancing at Diana and recognizing her as my attorney. "It's about the unusual inquiries we've been receiving this morning." Patricia was still speaking when I interrupted to end the call. "I appreciate your concern, Patricia, but I have other commitments this morning. We can continue this conversation later." Her response was swift and sharp. "Natalie, I hope you understand that these legal matters won't wait indefinitely. The longer these issues remain unaddressed, the more complicated they become to resolve." The threat was explicit enough that Diana, raised her eyebrows at the direct nature of Patricia's approach. The Chen family was clearly prepared to escalate their legal strategy if I didn't cooperate with their demands for voluntary asset transfer. After ending the call, Marcus explained that our investment firm had received multiple inquiries from legal representatives claiming to be conducting due diligence on behalf of family members. The inquiries had requested detailed information about my investment portfolio, business ownership structures, and financial management practices. They're fishing for information they can use to support whatever legal claims they're planning to make, Diana observed after reviewing the inquiry documents Marcus had brought. This is more sophisticated than typical family law disputes. They're conducting the kind of comprehensive financial investigation that usually precedes major litigation. The realization that the Chen family's legal strategy included attempts to gather information directly from my business partners and financial institutions revealed the extent of their ambitions. This wasn't just about accessing my assets. They were attempting to build a comprehensive understanding of my financial situation that would give them maximum leverage for whatever legal action they decided to pursue. Marcus's expression was grim as he shared additional information. They've also been contacting some of our investors, claiming to be conducting family financial planning research. Several people have called to ask whether they should be concerned about potential changes to our fund management structure. The Chen family's inquiries were threatening to disrupt my professional relationships and potentially damage the business I had built over several years. Their legal strategy wasn't just targeting my personal assets. It was attempting to undermine my professional reputation and business operations as a way of creating pressure for cooperation with their demands. Diana's assessment was stark and urgent. Natalie, they're not just pursuing legal claims against your assets. They're conducting a campaign designed to isolate you professionally and financially. This is economic warfare disguised as family financial planning. The conversation was interrupted by my phone, which showed Brandon's number. When I answered, his voice carried the kind of exhaustion that suggested he had been awake most of the night processing the implications of what he had witnessed at his parents' house. Natalie, I'm at home, and I think we need to talk immediately. There are some things I learned this morning that change everything about what my family is trying to do. Brandon's tone suggested that he had finally recognized the true nature of his parents' legal mobilization. The question was whether his understanding had developed quickly enough to prevent further damage to our relationship and my financial security. When I arrived home an hour later, I found Brandon sitting at our kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, financial statements, and printed emails. His expression was a mixture of shock, anger, and what appeared to be genuine shame as he looked up at me. They lied to me, he said without preamble. Everything they told me about protecting our family's interests and ensuring proper financial planning was a lie. These documents show they're trying to take control of your money, and they're using our marriage as justification for claims they have no right to make. The papers spread across our kitchen table told the story of a coordinated legal strategy that extended far beyond what Patricia had revealed in our phone conversation. The Chen family's attorneys had prepared preliminary motions for multiple legal actions, including community property claims, fraud allegations, and dependency arguments that could potentially expose my assets to claims from various family members. Most disturbing were the documents that revealed the true scope of their ambitions. Rather than seeking a one-time settlement or division of assets, they were planning to establish ongoing legal relationships that would give them permanent influence over how my wealth was managed and distributed. The trust structure Patricia had mentioned wasn't a protective measure. It was a mechanism for transferring control of my assets to a family entity they would dominate. Brandon's voice cracked slightly as he continued his explanation. They told me you had been hiding money that rightfully belonged to our family, and that I needed to help them make sure everyone's interests were protected. They said you had been manipulating our financial situation to maintain control over resources that should be shared with people who had helped support our marriage. The Chen family's manipulation of Brandon revealed the same pattern they had used throughout our relationship, but now applied to a situation where the stakes were dramatically higher. They had convinced him that my financial privacy represented a threat to family welfare rather than acknowledging it as individual choice about personal assets. I sat down across from Brandon, studying the legal documents that revealed the true nature of his family's response to my disclosure. The sophistication of their strategy was impressive and deeply disturbing. They had identified multiple legal theories that could potentially expose my assets to claims, and they were prepared to pursue those theories through comprehensive litigation, if necessary. The woman who had accommodated their expectations for 5 years was about to discover what happened when accommodation was no longer sufficient to preserve the peace. The Chen family's legal mobilization had transformed what might have been a private marital issue into a war that would require strategic defense of assets and rights I had never expected to have to protect within the context of my own family. Relationships. The comfortable deceptions that had structured our family dynamics were collapsing, but what was emerging from their ruins wasn't the authentic partnership I had hoped for. It was a conflict that would test everything I had learned about power, wealth, and the price of maintaining relationships with people who viewed my resources as opportunities, rather than respecting them as individual achievements that deserved protection and autonomy. The emergency board meeting of Harper Tech Ventures convened at 9 o'clock the following morning in the glass-walled conference room of our Pioneer Square headquarters. The assembled group represented the core leadership of the investment firm I had built over the past 4 years, along with key advisors whose expertise would be crucial for navigating the unprecedented situation the Chen family's legal assault had created. Marcus Thompson had spent the night coordinating with our legal team, financial advisors, and public relations consultants to develop a comprehensive response strategy. The documents spread across the conference table painted a clear picture of the sophisticated campaign being waged against not just my personal assets, but the business infrastructure I had carefully constructed to manage and grow my wealth. Caroline West, my financial advisor and former managing director at Goldman Sachs, opened the meeting with a detailed analysis of the Chen family's legal strategy. Their approach is more comprehensive than typical family law disputes, she began, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had made her one of Seattle's most respected wealth management professionals. They're not just targeting your personal assets, Natalie. They're attempting to establish legal precedents that would give them ongoing influence over how your entire portfolio is managed and distributed. The implications extended far beyond my immediate family situation. If the Chen family succeeded in establishing legal claims against my assets based on marriage and family relationships, it could set precedents that would affect other wealthy individuals who had chosen to maintain financial privacy within their personal relationships. The case had the potential to become a landmark dispute about individual property rights, spousal disclosure obligations, and the extent to which family relationships could be used to override personal financial autonomy. James Liu, the private investigator Diana had recommended, presented findings that revealed the true scope of the Chen family's preparation for this conflict. They didn't just hire attorneys after your disclosure at dinner, he reported, opening a thick folder of surveillance, photographs, and financial records. They've been researching your background and business activities for at least 6 months, possibly longer. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The Chen family's shock at my financial disclosure had been entirely manufactured. They had known about my wealth long before the anniversary dinner, and had been systematically preparing for the moment when they would have justification to make claims against assets they had been coveting for months. James continued his briefing with methodical precision. Patricia Chen has been meeting regularly with estate planning attorneys since last spring, discussing strategies for maximizing family asset integration in situations involving significant wealth disparities between spouses. Robert Chen has been consulting with tax professionals about trust structures that would allow family members to benefit from assets held in other names. Each piece of information revealed another layer of premeditation in what I had initially believed was an impulsive response to unexpected information. The Chen family hadn't been surprised by my wealth. They had been waiting for an opportunity to claim it, and my disclosure had simply provided the justification they needed to implement plans they had been developing for months. The photographs James displayed showed Patricia entering the offices of Harrington, Webb and Associates on multiple occasions during the summer, always carrying briefcases and staying for extended meetings. Other images captured Robert meeting with financial advisors whose specialties included asset protection strategies for family wealth planning. The documentation was comprehensive enough to demonstrate that the Chen family's legal mobilization had been planned well in advance of my anniversary dinner disclosure. Diana Rodriguez, who had been reviewing additional legal documents throughout the night, provided an update on the escalating situation. They filed formal discovery motions this morning, requesting complete financial records for the past 7 years, including all business transactions, investment activities, and personal expenditures. They're also demanding access to all communications between you and your professional advisors regarding asset management and tax planning strategies. The legal fishing expedition was designed to uncover any information that could support their various claims against my assets, while simultaneously creating maximum disruption to my business operations and personal privacy. The scope of their demands suggested they were prepared to engage in prolonged litigation with the goal of wearing down my resistance through legal costs and professional complications. More troubling, Diana continued, they've also filed motions requesting temporary restraining orders on certain asset transfers and business decisions. They're arguing that your individual control over significant wealth creates potential for economic harm to family members who have become dependent on your support. The legal theory was both creative and deeply disturbing. By transforming my voluntary financial assistance into evidence of family dependency, the Chen family's attorneys were attempting to establish ongoing legal obligations that would give them permanent claims against my assets. Rather than expressing gratitude for support that had maintained their comfortable lifestyle, they were using that support as grounds for demanding continued access to resources they had no legal right to claim. Marcus Thompson leaned forward, with the focused intensity he displayed during our most challenging investment negotiations. Natalie, we need to understand that this isn't just a family law dispute anymore. They're conducting economic warfare against your business operations, your professional relationships, and your ability to manage your own assets independently. This requires a response that matches the scope of their attack. His assessment was accurate and sobering. The Chen family's legal strategy wasn't limited to claims against my personal wealth. They were attempting to undermine the business infrastructure I had built, damage my professional reputation, and create legal precedents that would give them ongoing influence over decisions that should remain entirely within my individual control. Caroline West provided additional context that clarified the broader implications of the situation. I've been contacted by representatives from 3 of your major investment partners, she reported. They're concerned about potential changes to fund management structures and want reassurance that your legal situation won't affect their investment returns or create additional regulatory complications. The Chen family's legal assault was threatening to damage relationships I had cultivated over years of successful investment management. Their strategy included attempts to create uncertainty among my business partners and investors, using legal pressure to isolate me professionally while simultaneously pursuing claims against my personal assets. The meeting was interrupted by my assistant, who entered with an expression of barely controlled alarm. "Ms. Harper," she said, glancing nervously at the assembled group. "There are reporters in the lobby. They're asking questions about family legal disputes and requesting interviews about wealth disclosure and marriage situations." The Chen family had escalated their campaign beyond legal proceedings into public relations warfare. By leaking information about our dispute to media outlets, they were attempting to create additional pressure for settlement while positioning themselves as victims of my financial secrecy, rather than as aggressors pursuing unwarranted claims against my assets. Diana's response was immediate and strategic. "We need to control the narrative before they establish their version of events as the accepted truth," she said, already typing instructions into her phone. Their media strategy is designed to portray you as a secretive wife who deceived her family about financial resources, rather than as a successful businesswoman protecting her assets from inappropriate claims. The public relations dimension of the conflict required a different kind of strategic thinking than traditional legal defense. The Chen family was attempting to use media coverage to create social pressure for settlement while portraying their legal assault as justified response to my deceptive behavior. Countering their narrative would require transparency about issues I had previously kept private, but continued silence would allow them to define the terms of public discussion. Marcus Thompson made a suggestion that reflected his understanding of both business strategy and media dynamics. "We should consider proactive disclosure," he said thoughtfully. "Rather than responding defensively to their characterizations, we could present your story as a case study in entrepreneurial success and the importance of protecting individual financial autonomy within family relationships." The approach would require a fundamental shift in how I approached public discussion of my business activities and personal wealth. For years, I had maintained privacy about my financial success, partly from personal preference and partly to avoid the social complications that wealth disclosure often creates. The Chen family's media strategy was forcing me to choose between continued privacy and active defense of my reputation and legal rights. Caroline West supported Marcus's suggestion with additional strategic considerations. "The business community needs to understand that this case could set important precedents about individual property rights and family financial obligations," she observed. "If successful professionals feel they need to choose between marriage and financial autonomy, it creates problematic incentives for both personal relationships and economic development." Her point highlighted the broader implications of the Chen family's legal theories. If family relationships could be used to establish ongoing claims against individual wealth, it would create incentives for successful people to avoid marriage or maintain complete financial separation from their families. The potential impact on social relationships and economic partnerships could be significant if the Chen family's approach was allowed to succeed. James Liu provided an update that revealed another dimension of the conflict. "I've identified the source of the media leaks," he reported, displaying surveillance photographs of Patricia Chen meeting with a public relations consultant who specialized in crisis management for high-profile family disputes. "They're not just reacting to media interest. They're actively generating it as part of their pressure campaign." The revelation confirmed that the Chen family's strategy included sophisticated public relations tactics designed to complement their legal assault. They were simultaneously pursuing claims through the courts while attempting to create social pressure for settlement through media coverage that portrayed me as a deceptive spouse rather than a successful entrepreneur protecting her legitimate assets. Diana Rodriguez outlined the legal response strategy we would implement to counter their various claims. "We'll file motions to dismiss their fraud allegations," she explained, displaying legal documents our team had prepared overnight. "Their theory that financial privacy constitutes fraud has no basis in Washington state law, and we have documentation showing that your asset development occurred independently of any marital financial planning. The legal defense would require detailed documentation of my professional activities, investment strategies, and business development timeline to demonstrate that my wealth had been accumulated through individual effort rather than through resources that should be considered marital property. The process would involve extensive disclosure of business information I had previously kept confidential, but the alternative was allowing the Chen family's claims to proceed without challenge. More importantly," Diana continued, "we'll file counterclaims for harassment, attempted extortion, and intentional interference with business relationships. Their legal strategy includes tactics that exceed legitimate family law proceedings and constitute actionable harm to your professional activities and personal reputation." The counteroffensive would transform the legal dispute from defensive response to active challenge of the Chen family's tactics. Rather than simply defending against their claims, we would be pursuing legal action against them for the inappropriate methods they had used to pressure me for access to assets they had no legitimate right to claim. Caroline West raised an important Strategic consideration. Natalie, we need to discuss whether you want to maintain your marriage to Brandon while pursuing this legal conflict with his family, she said carefully. The dynamics could become extremely complicated if you're simultaneously defending against claims from his parents while trying to preserve your relationship with him. The question touched the most personal dimension of the entire situation. Brandon's growing awareness of his family's true intentions had created the possibility of genuine partnership between us. But the legal warfare his parents were conducting could make such partnership practically impossible to maintain. The choice between preserving my marriage and protecting my assets was the kind of impossible decision the Chen family's strategy was designed to force. Before I could respond to Caroline's question, my phone rang with a call from Brandon. His voice carried a mixture of determination and apprehension that suggested he had made important decisions about his role in the escalating conflict. "Natalie, I'm calling from a lawyer's office," he said without preamble. "I've retained independent legal counsel to represent my interests separately from my parents' legal team. There are some things you need to know about what they're planning that I learned this morning." The revelation that Brandon had hired his own attorney, rather than allowing his parents' lawyers to represent his interests, represented a significant development in the family dynamics. His decision to seek independent counsel suggested he had recognized the conflict between his parents' goals and his own welfare as my spouse. "My attorney has reviewed all the documents my parents wanted me to sign," Brandon continued, his voice strengthening with each word. "They weren't trying to protect my interests. They were trying to use me as a vehicle for accessing your assets while making it appear that I was voluntarily participating in their legal strategy." Diana Rodriguez leaned forward with professional interest. "Brandon, this is Diana Rodriguez, Natalie's attorney. What specifically did your parents' lawyers want you to authorize?" Brandon's response revealed the full scope of the Chen family's manipulation. "They wanted me to sign documents that would give them authority to act on my behalf in all matters related to marital asset division," he explained. "They also wanted me to authorize them to make claims for spousal support and community property division that would maximize my share of Natalie's assets." The strategy was sophisticated and deeply manipulative. Rather than making direct claims against my assets, the Chen family's attorneys were attempting to use Brandon as a front for legal action that would appear to be initiated by my spouse rather than by his parents. The approach would have allowed them to pursue maximum financial claims while maintaining the appearance that Brandon was protecting his legitimate marital rights rather than serving as an instrument for his parents' economic objectives. Diana's professional assessment was swift and clear. "Brandon, the documents your parents wanted you to sign would have made you a plaintiff in legal action against your wife's assets, regardless of your actual wishes about the matter. You would have been committing to pursue claims you might not want to make while giving other people control over how those claims were prosecuted." The explanation seemed to crystallize Brandon's understanding of how close he had come to being manipulated into betraying our marriage while believing he was protecting it. His parents had convinced him that signing their legal documents was necessary for his financial security, when the actual effect would have been to transform him into an unwilling participant in their assault on my independence and assets. "I need to tell you something else," Brandon continued, his voice now carrying a firmness I hadn't heard from him in years. "I'm prepared to testify on your behalf about our actual financial arrangements, about my knowledge of your business activities, and about my parents' attempts to manipulate me into pursuing claims I don't want to make." His offer represented a complete reversal of the family loyalties that had shaped our relationship for 5 years. Brandon was choosing partnership with me over accommodation to his parents' demands, even when that choice would put him in direct conflict with family members who had always been central to his decision-making process. Diana Rodriguez recognized the strategic significance of Brandon's position. "Brandon, your testimony could be crucial for defending against several of their legal theories," she explained. "Your direct knowledge of the financial arrangements in your marriage, combined with your understanding of your parents' true motivations, could undermine their claims that Natalie's financial privacy constituted fraud or deception. The legal defense strategy was becoming clearer as we integrated Brandon's willingness to testify with the other elements of our comprehensive response. Rather than simply defending against the Chen family's claims, we could present evidence that exposed their true motivations, while demonstrating that my financial privacy had been a reasonable personal choice, rather than deceptive behavior designed to harm family relationships. Marcus Thompson raised the broader strategic question that would determine our overall approach to the conflict. Natalie, we need to decide whether we're going to fight this battle on the terms they've established, or whether we're going to change the entire framework of the engagement, he said thoughtfully. Their strategy depends on keeping this focused on family law disputes and financial disclosure obligations. We have the option of making this about business ethics, individual rights, and the appropriate boundaries between personal relationships and professional autonomy. His suggestion represented a fundamental shift in how we approach the conflict. Rather than accepting the Chen family's characterization of the dispute as a family law matter involving spousal obligations and asset disclosure, we could reframe. It is a business and civil rights issue involving the protection of individual economic achievements from inappropriate family claims. The reframing would require public engagement with issues I had previously handled privately, but it would also position me as a successful entrepreneur defending legitimate business interests, rather than as a secretive spouse avoiding family financial obligations. The narrative shift could transform public perception of the conflict, while establishing legal precedents that would protect other individuals facing similar pressure from family members who viewed their wealth as collective resources rather than personal achievements. Caroline West provided the financial analysis that would support this strategic approach. Natalie's business success represents exactly the kind of entrepreneurial achievement that economic development policies are designed to encourage, she observed. If family relationships can be used to establish ongoing claims against individual business assets, it creates disincentives for risk-taking and innovation that could have broader economic implications. The meeting concluded with a clear strategic framework for responding to the Chen family's comprehensive assault. We would defend aggressively against their legal claims while simultaneously launching a counteroffensive that exposed their inappropriate tactics and established important precedents about individual financial autonomy. The response would require transparency about business activities I had previously kept private, but the alternative was allowing their false narrative to define public understanding of the conflict. As the advisors dispersed to implement their various responsibilities, I remained in the conference room with Marcus Thompson, reflecting on how completely the situation had evolved from the simple family dinner where this conflict had begun. The Chen family's legal mobilization had transformed what might have been a private marital disagreement into a high-stakes battle over fundamental questions of individual rights, family obligations, and the extent to which personal relationships could be used to override economic autonomy. The woman who had accommodated their expectations for 5 years was about to discover what happened when accommodation was no longer sufficient to preserve the peace. But instead of retreating into defensive legal strategies, I was choosing to change the entire framework of the engagement, transforming their assault on my assets into an opportunity to establish important precedents about the protection of individual achievement from inappropriate family claims. The comfortable deceptions that had structured our family dynamics were gone forever. But what was emerging from their collapse wasn't just authentic partnership with Brandon. It was a comprehensive defense of principles that extended far beyond my personal situation to establish important protections for other successful individuals who might face similar pressure from family members who confused access to wealth with entitlement to control it. The Washington State Superior Court hearing that would determine the outcome of Chen v. Harper. Chen convened on a crisp October morning, 6 weeks after our anniversary dinner had set this entire conflict in motion. Judge Sarah Martinez presided over a courtroom packed with legal observers, business journalists, and family law attorneys who recognized that the case would establish important precedents about individual financial autonomy within marriage relationships. Diana Rodriguez stood at the plaintiff's table with quiet confidence, surrounded by the comprehensive documentation we had assembled to counter every aspect of the Chen family's legal assault. Across the aisle, the attorneys from Harrington, Webb, and Associates appeared increasingly uncomfortable as they prepared to argue claims that had become more difficult to justify with each passing week of discovery proceedings. The 6 weeks of legal preparation had transformed the landscape of the conflict entirely. What had begun as the Chen family's coordinated attack on my assets had evolved into a comprehensive defense of individual rights that had garnered support from business, organizations, women's advocacy groups, and civil liberties foundations across the Pacific Northwest. The case had become a symbol of the tension between family obligations and personal autonomy that resonated far beyond our specific circumstances. Judge Martinez called the court to order and immediately addressed the unusual level of public interest in what might otherwise have been a routine family law proceeding. This case raises important questions about the balance between spousal disclosure obligations and individual financial privacy rights, she observed, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who understood the broader implications of her eventual ruling. The court will consider not only the specific claims presented by the parties, but also the precedential impact of our decision on similar situations throughout Washington state. Diana Rodriguez opened our defense with a comprehensive presentation that systematically dismantled each of the Chen family's legal theories while establishing the broader principles at stake in the dispute. Your Honor, she began, this case represents an attempt to use family relationships as weapons for acquiring assets that were developed through individual professional achievement. The plaintiffs are seeking to establish legal precedents that would make successful entrepreneurs vulnerable to claims from family members who view wealth as collective property rather than respecting it as personal accomplishment. Her opening statement positioned the conflict exactly as we had strategized, transforming the Chen family's characterization of the dispute from a family law matter involving spousal obligations into a civil rights issue involving the protection of individual economic achievements from inappropriate family claims. The reframing had been crucial for building public support and legal precedent that extended far beyond our specific situation. The evidence presentation that followed revealed the full extent of the Chen family's premeditated strategy. James Liu's investigation had uncovered a paper trail documenting months of legal consultation, financial planning, and strategic preparation that had begun long before my anniversary dinner disclosure. The Chen family's shock at learning about my wealth had been entirely manufactured. They had known about my assets and had been systematically preparing to claim them at the first available opportunity. Diana displayed surveillance photographs showing Patricia Chen meeting with estate planning attorneys throughout the summer, discussing strategies for maximizing family access to assets held in other names. Additional documentation revealed Robert Chen's consultations with tax professionals about trust structures designed to benefit family members from wealth they hadn't contributed to creating. The evidence painted a clear picture of calculated preparation for legal action that had nothing to do with protecting family welfare and everything to do with acquiring resources they had no legitimate claim to possess. Most damaging to their case was the revelation of their media manipulation strategy. James Liu had obtained internal communications from the public relations firm Patricia Chen had hired to generate negative coverage about my financial privacy. The documents showed detailed planning for a media campaign designed to portray me as a deceptive spouse rather than a successful entrepreneur protecting legitimate assets from inappropriate claims. The Chen family's attorneys struggled to explain away the evidence of premeditation and manipulation. Their original narrative about surprised family members responding to unexpected financial disclosure collapsed under the weight of documentation, showing months of careful preparation for exactly the legal assault they had launched. Their claims about protecting family welfare were contradicted by evidence of sophisticated strategies designed to maximize their access to assets they had contributed nothing toward creating. When called to testify on his parents' behalf, Brandon declined to support their legal claims and instead provided testimony that contradicted several key elements of their case. His account of our actual financial arrangements, combined with his detailed knowledge of his parents' manipulation tactics, undermined their arguments about fraudulent concealment and family dependency. His willingness to testify truthfully despite family pressure demonstrated the fundamental transformation our relationship had undergone during the weeks of legal conflict. The most powerful moment in Brandon's testimony came when Diana Rodriguez asked him to explain his understanding of his parents' true motivations for pursuing legal action against my assets. He paused for several seconds, glancing at Patricia and Robert Chen before responding with quiet conviction. "My parents weren't trying to protect our family's financial security," he said clearly. "They were trying to gain control over wealth they had discovered and decided they were entitled to access. They used our marriage as justification for claims they had no right to make, and they attempted to manipulate me into participating in legal action against my wife that I never wanted to pursue." His testimony created a moment of profound silence in the courtroom. The Chen family's entire legal strategy had depended on presenting their claims as protective measures designed to ensure family welfare and proper financial management. Brandon's direct contradiction of that narrative, delivered by their own son and backed by comprehensive documentation, effectively destroyed the credibility of their case. Patricia Chen's testimony on her own behalf revealed the depth of her sense of entitlement to assets she had played no role in creating. Under cross-examination by Diana Rodriguez, she insisted that my financial privacy had damaged the family's ability to make informed decisions about collective welfare. Her responses demonstrated a fundamental inability to recognize the difference between individual achievement and family property, even when presented with clear evidence of my independent professional activities. When Diana asked Patricia to explain why she believed she was entitled to ongoing support from my assets, her answer revealed the core assumption that had driven their entire legal assault. "Natalie became part of our family when she married Brandon." Patricia replied with the same authoritative tone she had always used when discussing family expectations. "Family resources should be managed collectively for everyone's benefit, not hoarded by individuals who put their personal interests above family welfare." The response crystallized everything that had been wrong with my relationship with the Chen family from the beginning. In Patricia's worldview, my marriage to Brandon had automatically transferred my individual achievements into collective family property that should be managed according to her expectations rather than my preferences. My financial independence wasn't being viewed as personal accomplishment to be respected, but as selfishness to be corrected through appropriate legal action. Diana's cross-examination exposed the logical contradictions in Patricia's position. If family resources should be managed collectively, she asked, why hadn't Patricia disclosed her own consultations with estate planning attorneys to the rest of the family? If transparency was essential for proper family financial planning, why had she concealed her legal research and media manipulation strategies from Brandon and me? Patricia's inability to answer these questions coherently highlighted the fundamental hypocrisy of her position. She demanded transparency and collective management from me while maintaining secrecy about her own financial planning and legal strategies. Her definition of family cooperation required my submission to her authority while exempting her from the same obligations she sought to impose on others. The business community testimony that followed provided crucial context for understanding the broader implications of the Chen family's legal theories. Caroline West presented detailed analysis showing how their approach to family financial obligations could create disincentives for entrepreneurial risk-taking and business development. If successful professionals had to choose between marriage and financial autonomy, she explained, it would discourage both personal relationships and economic innovation in ways that could have significant societal costs. Representatives from the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, the Washington State Bar Association's Business Law Section, and the Pacific Northwest Women in Business Alliance all provided testimony supporting the importance of protecting individual financial achievements from inappropriate family claims. Their participation transformed the case from a personal dispute into a broader policy discussion about the appropriate balance between family obligations and individual rights. The media coverage throughout the trial had evolved from initial curiosity about wealthy family disputes into serious analysis of the legal and social issues at stake. Editorial coverage in the Seattle Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg Business had consistently supported the principle that individual financial achievements should be protected from family claims that weren't based on actual contribution to wealth creation. The public relations dimension of the conflict had been crucial for building support that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. Rather than allowing the Chen family to define public understanding of the dispute, we had successfully positioned the case as a defense of entrepreneurial achievement and individual rights that resonated with audiences who understood the importance of protecting personal accomplishments from inappropriate claims by family members who confused access with entitlement. Judge Martinez's ruling, delivered after 3 days of testimony and legal argument, was comprehensive and decisive in ways that established important precedents for similar cases throughout Washington state. The court finds that the plaintiffs have failed to establish any legitimate basis for their claims against the defendant's assets, she declared, her voice carrying the weight of careful legal analysis. The evidence presented demonstrates that Ms. Harper's wealth was developed through individual professional achievement before and during her marriage, and that her choice to maintain financial privacy was a reasonable personal decision rather than fraudulent concealment designed to harm family relationships. More significantly, the court finds that the plaintiff's legal strategy constituted harassment and attempted extortion rather than legitimate family law proceedings. Their premeditated campaign to acquire assets they had no right to claim, combined with their manipulation of media coverage and family relationships, exceeded the bounds of appropriate legal action and caused substantial harm to the defendant's professional reputation and business operations. The ruling went beyond simply dismissing the Chen family's claims to establish important protections for individual financial autonomy within family relationships. Judge Martinez's decision created legal precedent that would make it more difficult for family members to use marriage or other relationships as justification for claiming assets they had played no role in creating. The court orders the plaintiffs to pay full attorney fees and court costs incurred by the defendant in defending against these inappropriate claims, Judge Martinez continued. Additionally, the court grants the defendant's request for a permanent restraining order, preventing further harassment or interference with her business operations and professional relationships. The financial penalties imposed on the Chen family were substantial enough to ensure they would face real consequences for their attempted asset grab, while sending a clear message to other potential litigants who might consider similar strategies. The restraining order provided ongoing protection against future harassment while establishing legal precedent that could benefit other individuals facing comparable pressure from family members who viewed their wealth as collective property. As we left the courthouse, the late afternoon October sun illuminated downtown Seattle with golden light that seemed to symbolize the clarity that had emerged from months of legal conflict. The reporters gathered on the courthouse steps asked questions that focused on the broader implications of the ruling rather than the personal details of family disputes. The case had successfully transcended individual circumstances to establish principles that would protect other entrepreneurs from similar attacks on their financial independence. Diana Rodriguez provided a brief statement that captured the essential significance of our victory. This ruling establishes that individual financial achievements cannot be treated as family property simply because of marriage or other relationships, she declared to the assembled media representatives. The court has protected the fundamental principle that personal accomplishments deserve respect and protection from inappropriate claims by family members who confuse access with entitlement. The statement positioned our victory as a defense of entrepreneurial rights and individual autonomy, rather than as a personal triumph over difficult family relationships. The broader principle was more important than the specific outcome, and the legal precedent would provide protection for other successful individuals who might face similar pressure from family members who viewed their wealth as opportunities rather than achievements deserving respect. Brandon and I walked home together through the familiar streets of downtown Seattle, passing the buildings and landmarks that had formed the geography of our shared life for 5 years. The city looked different now, not because anything external had changed, but because our understanding of ourselves and our relationship had been fundamentally transformed by the process of defending against his family's assault on my independence and assets. The comfortable deceptions that had structured our marriage were gone forever, replaced by authentic communication about issues we had previously avoided discussing. Brandon's decision to choose partnership with me over accommodation to his parents' expectations had created the foundation for genuine relationship based on mutual respect rather than carefully managed performances designed to satisfy external authorities. Our house in Queen Anne felt different when we entered that evening, though every physical detail remained exactly as it had been before this conflict began. The kitchen where Brandon had first learned the truth about my financial situation, the living spaces that had been furnished through invisible subsidies he hadn't understood, the domestic environment that had represented careful performance rather than authentic partnership. All of it had been transformed by honesty that made continued deception impossible. We sat together at the kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had occurred during the past 6 weeks, but this time the discussion focused on building our future rather than defending against attacks from his family. The legal victory had established our right to make independent decisions about our relationship and resources, free from interference by family members who had confused their preferences with enforceable obligations. The financial arrangements that had once required secrecy could now be discussed openly, with Brandon fully aware of the resources available to support our shared goals and individual aspirations. The business activities I had previously concealed could be integrated into our household planning without fear that honesty would create complications we weren't prepared to handle. The wealth that had once been a source of potential conflict had become a foundation for opportunities we could pursue together as genuine partners. Most importantly, the invisible boundaries that had constrained our relationship for years had been replaced by consciously chosen parameters that reflected our actual values and preferences rather than accommodating external expectations we had never agreed to accept. Brandon's transformation from someone who reflexively deferred to family authority into someone who actively defended our partnership had created space for authentic communication about issues that affected our shared future. The Chen family's legal assault had failed completely, but its most significant consequence wasn't the court ruling or financial penalties. It was the revelation of character that had occurred under pressure, showing who was capable of growth and authentic partnership versus who remained committed to manipulation and control, regardless of the costs to family relationships. Patricia and Robert Chen had lost more than their legal case. They had lost their son's respect and trust, along with any possibility of ongoing relationship with me, or access to the comfortable retirement lifestyle my invisible support had provided for years. Their attempt to transform my generosity into legal obligation had resulted in complete severance of the financial assistance they had been receiving without acknowledgement or gratitude. The irony was profound and entirely appropriate. The family members who had accused me of being a gold digger motivated by access to their resources had revealed themselves to be exactly what they had projected onto me: opportunistic individuals who viewed wealth as something to be acquired through manipulation rather than earned through effort. Their legal strategy had exposed their true character, while demonstrating the fundamental authenticity of my commitment to supporting family relationships without expecting recognition or control in return. Brandon and I spent the evening making plans for the future that no longer required secrecy, performance, or accommodation to expectations we had never truly accepted. The wealth that had once been a source of potential conflict had become a foundation for opportunities we could pursue as genuine partners who understood and respected each other's actual circumstances and aspirations. The legal victory had established important precedents that would protect other successful individuals from similar family manipulation. But the personal victory was even more significant. I had reclaimed not just my assets and professional reputation, but my authentic identity as someone who refused to allow family relationships to override individual autonomy and achievement. The woman who had accommodated inappropriate expectations for 5 years had discovered the strength to defend principles that mattered more than surface harmony. The comfortable deceptions that had structured our family dynamics were gone forever, replaced by authentic relationships based on mutual respect, honest communication, and conscious choice, rather than inherited obligation or manipulated compliance. As we prepared for bed in our house that no longer represented careful performance but genuine partnership, I touched the simple wedding ring that had symbolized compromised identity for so many years. It felt different now, representing not surrender of independence but conscious choice to build something meaningful with someone who had demonstrated the capacity for growth, authenticity, and genuine partnership when tested by circumstances that revealed true character. The foundation we were building together was stronger than the one we had lost, constructed from honesty rather than accommodation, mutual respect rather than managed expectations, and shared values rather than inherited obligations. The future we faced together would be shaped by conscious choices rather than external pressures, authentic communication rather than diplomatic silence, and genuine partnership rather than carefully orchestrated performances designed to satisfy authorities we had never agreed to recognize. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.